Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction and to the organizers for including our paper in the program. This is joint work with Carla Hironen, Noreen Kachiwala, and Develina Rakshid, who are all colleagues of mine at IFPRI. So the main motivation for this paper, around the world, around 120 million people are forcibly displaced, often by conflict, as well as climate-induced disasters. And the majority of IDPs live in protracted, precarious conditions, generally in low-income countries. Much humanitarian aid focuses on short-term relief, cash, food, vouchers, etc., and often doesn't address structural drivers of poverty. Graduation programs, a term that encompasses bundled interventions that generally include transfers, provision of assets, training, and often savings groups and or some type of household coaching, have been shown to be effective in multiple stable settings. Starting with a large 6-country study published in Science more than 10 years ago, and now this literature has grown very rapidly. There's very little evidence for displaced populations. Displaced populations often live in settings that may lack complementary public services. They may have very limited access to land or other productive resources. That being said, these multifaceted interventions may have the potential to attack entrenched poverty. Our goal here is to assess the effects of a graduation program known as the Ultra Poor Graduation Program, or UPG, it's a common acronym, rolled out to internally displaced people in Baidoa, Somalia. And to just be explicit, that means they were displaced from other regions of Somalia, but they did not cross an international border. Of course, that has implications for their ability to generally interact freely in the local economy in a way that might not be true for international refugees. We have a sample of 4,000 households. They were randomly assigned to receive the treatment or fail to receive it. And this was given a predetermined fixed limit on eligibility. So I'll describe this slightly more, but there were about 6,200 households in the IDP sites who were identified as eligible, and there was a fixed program cap of 5,000 households. So given that, conditional on eligibility, a lottery was considered to be a fair strategy to allocate the treatment, and our sample is a subsample of the full group. The intervention provides short-term cash support, short-term is a year, followed by an asset transfer or technical vocational training. Households can choose. And savings groups with some minimal coaching, but not particularly intensive or household level coaching as may be seen in other models. And we tracked households for 3 years with minimal attrition. The final survey, 3 years post-baseline, is right around the point that formal program activities are concluding. So it should be considered a relatively short-term follow-up. We find that the intervention has large positive effects on the primary outcomes of interest. There's a substantial increase in consumption, both food and non-food, about 30%. A large increase in household assets, that's overwhelmingly goats, the 300% increase in asset value from a very low base in the control arm, and a substantial increase in the probability of savings. These effects are, again, overwhelmingly driven by increased income from livestock. So one potential caveat here is there's very little evidence of any meaningful diversification. Some households were provided with goats, and they have used those goats to generate a higher income and consumption stream, but beyond that, we haven't seen transformation in other dimensions of livelihoods. So we contribute to a growing literature on multifaceted interventions that are aimed at increasing income and self-sufficiency among refugees and IDPs. There are several other recent papers looking at largely unconditional cash transfers or transfers and training. Several of these papers are also in camp settings, which this is not, and I'll describe that slightly more. There's a large and very rapidly growing literature on graduation model programs that I have not fully cited. We are evaluating a graduation model in a forced displacement context, and this is relatively rare, with 2 other recent papers in what you could consider conflict or post-conflict settings in Yemen and Afghanistan. Just to describe the model, so UPG was implemented by World Vision with the collaboration of ACTED. This project was funded by USAID, both the implementation and the research. It provides short-term cash support to IDP households, around $250 over a year. They then can choose either the asset track or the TVET track, and they participate in savings groups and receive group-level coaching throughout. Households were eligible if they lived in certain target neighborhoods. The neighborhoods were essentially IDP sites. They're predominantly, though not exclusively, IDPs. By predominantly, I mean about 94%, so they're overwhelmingly IDPs. So a small number of host community households living in the same neighborhoods who also entered the program. They've been resident for at least 1 year and reported at least moderate food insecurity at baseline. This is a very weak condition. Almost everyone in these sites is reporting at least moderate food insecurity. And this generated our sample of around 6,200 eligible households. And then we conducted randomization at the household level. 5,000 entered the program. A subset of those also entered the survey. We surveyed households at baseline, 2022, and then again in 2023 and 2024, by which point the program was concluding. The context, so Baidoa is one of the largest cities in Somalia, in southwest Somalia, relatively close to the capital. The second map shows the city limits of Baidoa, and the red dots are IDP sites. So these are scattered sites within a generally urban environment. This is not a camp. And here are a couple of other images. This is central Baidoa, so it's a city. And on the right is an example of an IDP site. This is more in a peri-urban area. You can see it's not as dense as the central city, but limited access to land and still a predominantly non-agricultural setting. We find that the intervention was generally implemented with high fidelity when we surveyed households about their participation. 71% of households in the treatment arm self-reported, yes, they had participated in UPG, they identified the program as such. Nearly 90% reported they had received cash as intended. 85% reported they had received assets or TVET training as intended. In the control arm, nearly 100% reported they had received neither. Of the asset recipients, 80% selected goats. This was a quite overwhelming choice. Among those that didn't select goats, chickens, sewing machines, other types of productive assets. Among the training group, I didn't put that on the slide, you see a much wider variation in the type of training selected. Mechanical, automotive, beauty salon, kind of a typical TVET mix. So I'll largely describe the findings graphically just because of time. We see in generally quite large effects on consumption, food security, assets, and savings. And as I noted, this seems to be driven by income from livestock. So for consumption and poverty, here we're reporting on the left household daily per capita consumption expenditures in purchasing power parity terms, and on the right the extreme poverty rate based on the $1.90 poverty line. We didn't measure consumption at baseline, so the first wave is at midline. We can see already there's been some treatment effect at midline. The cash was essentially almost entirely delivered prior to the midline survey, and even at that point, average consumption is only about $2 per person per day. It's increased by about 20 cents, and that's associated with a 5 percentage point decline in poverty. Those effects have grown over time quite substantially. The delivery of the asset or the commencement of training was right around our midline survey. It varies at the household level, whether they had already received goats or they were about to receive goats. But by the next year, this effect has now grown to 80 cents relative to the mean of $2, and the effect on the poverty rate has increased to 25 percentage points. You can see the relative stagnation for the control arm. So very little evidence of growth for those not participating in the program. For assets and food security, this is just a count number of assets. We've also generated estimates of asset value based on local prices. Here we have baseline data, so you can observe balance at baseline as intended, and have a steady trajectory, positive trajectory for the treatment. 2 assets at midline, nearly 5 assets at endline. Here, control households show a slightly downward trend. This is the percentage of households on the household hunger scale that do not report moderate or severe hunger. Of course, that's 0 by construction at baseline. Households have to report moderate or severe hunger according to the household hunger scale to enter the trial.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
What was the scale of the asset transfer? So the difference you see at midline, is that what they got, basically? Is that
to 4 goats. So this reflects the fact that not everyone receives goats, but yes, essentially that's what they got. And then it grows. Goats reproduce, or we attribute this after having done a number of goat accounting exercises, primarily as natural growth. But of course, there's also some sale. One attractive aspect of goats is that the baby goats can arrive quite quickly. So for the HHS, we see that all households are characterized by hunger at baseline. Here, control households, in fact, do seem to be improving their status. This might be some reversion to the mean, so the percentage reporting hunger has declined over time, and more so for the treated. And here are the findings for income. So here for the first time, I'll report a table. So we asked a series of questions at N-line about household source of income. There are some notable gaps in this data. We see actually a large number of households reporting that they don't have any source of income, which is implausible given their consumption levels and given that cash transfers had already concluded. That being said, we do see this very large positive effect on any livestock income. So it's only about 2% in the control arm. Almost no one has income from livestock. It's increased to about 70% in the treatment arm. And we estimate the amount of income, and that can be quite noisy. Any non-farm income, so that's a non-agricultural household business, about 15%. In the control arm, we do see a positive treatment effect here. It's not particularly large, about 5 percentage points. And any wage income, this is the composite of both formal and informal wage income. We don't see a treatment effect here. If you break this down, we do see that treated households are shifting away from informal wage employment, which is often associated as a coping mechanism. There's a very small increase in formal wage employment. It's about 2 percentage points. But overall, it seems clear the vast majority of the benefits are derived from livestock, with this not even associated with a significant increase in income when captured continuously, though those estimates are noisy. So it seems clear the goat transfers were highly effective. There's very little evidence here that the TVIT path has generated any evidence, other than, again, maybe a 2 percentage point increase in formal employment. I think the key question looking forward would be how sustainable growth in livestock income alone would be to sustain these high consumption gains. So just to conclude, we see overall the UPG intervention had quite large positive effects. It's worth noting other papers assessing effects on IDPs often do find quite large effects, larger than for non-IDP populations. That would be consistent with the hypothesis that they face particularly tight constraints ex ante on their economic activities. This is over a relatively short time horizon, and we see an absence of income diversification even on that short time horizon. This does suggest that the same multifaceted livelihoods interventions that have been effective in reducing poverty for more stable, non-displaced populations could also be effective for IDPs. Great, thank you very much.